and there are many other examples. Just a little bit of sidetrack. Okay, back to this slide then. The second level in ECMA is the General Assembly, where the highest level members have voting rights only, and on the technical level, each member has voting rights, whether you are an industry or a not-for-profit organization like universities or governmental organizations, etc. There everybody has one vote, but in the GA only the highest level companies. And there, for instance, they decide things that have nothing to do with the technical side of the development of the standard. In ECMA it is forbidden on the technical level to talk about patents, for instance. And I insist on that. That is very easy. Engineers don't know anything about patents, and they talk about it like cars, like taxis, like a good bar, and all these sort of things, and it doesn't make any sense. Secondly, we do not allow to have journalists in the room. Nobody can report what happens in an ECMA technical meeting. Also very simple. I have never seen a journalist who has ever written one line in a standard. It is not helping us. And there is a lot of work to do. Certainly if you want to do a catch-up action. But IPR, I stress it a little bit here, is a typical subject that has come up around OpenXML, of course. But we should not enforce standardization bodies to make statements about that. Again, pretty simple, they can't. They don't have the resources. They don't have the expertise. They don't have the money to do that. It is simply not their role. If you want to say something about patents, or if you have a discussion between a licensor and a licensee, for instance, the only place to go and to get a real decision that is accepted in the world is in court, and not in ISO, and not in ECMA. The only thing that such organizations ask is to the owners of patents, are you willing to grant a license on so-called RAND conditions, reasonable and non-discriminatory conditions. But if you would ever ask any standardization body in the world to figure out or to determine what means that, what does that mean, you will never get an answer. Because they will even not try to define it. And also that is pretty simple. If an elephant and a small company make a licensing contract, that will be very difficult, different from a situation that two elephants make a licensing agreement. They can do cross-licensing and all sorts of other things that a small one and a big one cannot. And what reasonable is reasonable for the small organization may not be reasonable at all for a big other company. If I look to IBM, and it still has an enormous portfolio of patents, if it is a small company, they will not sue that company if it infringes on the patent. That's the practice in the United States. The reason? It takes 3 years in court and $3 million. Most small companies don't exist anymore then. So IBM never will get anything out of that. They simply don't do that anymore. But between big companies, of course, this can become an interesting thing. Also important to realize in this context is the RAND conditions are a sort of minimum set of conditions. Of course, if you can arrange that you need not to pay a license fee, so have it royalty free, of course great. But it's not demanded by standard bodies. It's also not demanded by the European Commission. And if you read Larry Rosen's book about 32 of the different GPL variations, and the book is still growing, then of course you will not find in such environments statements that it must be a GPL license or things like that. Also the European Commission will not ever demand that. So it's very important to realize what the standardization body can do with respect to IPR. And what they do is the following, and that's the best effort I think they can do. Several of them collect information about patents in a voluntary way. So each company can say to ISO, I have these and these patents and we believe they are relevant. ISO will not make an assessment whether they are really relevant, but they will put them in a database Everybody can see them. So for a starter who wants to make a product conforming to a particular standard, at least he has an idea what are relevant patterns. But he has to find out himself whether what is really relevant and what not. ISO will not help that. I think it's good to realize that. And also, ECMA has done that, of course, with Microsoft. And I think in ECMA we were very pleased because it's much more than the rent conditions that ECMA demands that has been promised by Microsoft, for instance. And we are not aware that there are other companies with IPR, intellectual property rights, in this field. So we have not got any other information. Okay, the GA usually meets twice a year and then takes two decisions. First, they decide whether a certain standard will be published. They don't usually look to the technical contents. They only decide whether to publish it or not. Sometimes it's politically not wise to publish a standard. You want to hear an example of that, of course? One example is the radiation of screens. Many years that has been a big problem in Europe, or not only in Europe. For instance, you get immediately unions on your doorstep and they said, can you prove that if a woman is pregnant that she can stay pregnant in front of such a screen? Sorry, we can't. But it creates an enormous fuss, of course, if you come with such sort of standards that give only measurement methods, but the reaction in the world will be, oh, there comes a standard, there must be something wrong here, there must be a problem. And then you better don't publish. That's just one example. Okay, the second one is the decision to go for fast track or not. It's an explicit decision by the General Assembly of ECMA and by any P member, for instance, when they want to submit a standard for fast track. Mr. Dos Santos has already said what is a standard. I think I need not to say too much about it. But one of my favorite things, typically in the context of ICT, is a standard is usually what I call a what document. It describes what the product has to do, but not how. If you only have a standard, usually you cannot make a product. You need to know much more. Yeah? So the second one is also important. It is not a product specification. So if some people ask a lot of additional information, maybe to make a clone of a Microsoft product, it is not business for ISO. It's not a business for ECMA. The standard is a thing on its own. And very important, the standard, for instance, can never infringe on a patent. Only the product can, because the product is using the technical solutions provided by the patent. But the standard only says, you must do this and this. And if you do not find another way than using the patent, okay, then you must find a way to deal with that patent and get a licensing agreement. And there are very simple reasons, for instance, to usually say it is only a minimum set of requirements. And that is to leave enough room or maximum room for competing products. It would be crazy to have an open XML standard and only have let's say the Microsoft product, so the implementation of that standard. If everybody would make a clone of that, we don't need a standard, we just can try to get it from Microsoft and that's it. But of course, this one, hopefully, and it does already in practice, there are at the moment more than 300 companies making products. And they are using the ECMA standard because now they say, oh, we are no longer in the hands, in the grip of Microsoft. We cannot do, we know now what is meant. That is happening. Last week, during the BRM, I have given demos of 7 products, for instance, a Symbian, a SUSE Linux system, even an iPhone. I had to sit on it because in Switzerland you still cannot buy it, and all these sorts of things. There was a Nokia machine, there was of course a Windows machine, and all these things could, as it is called, I think today it was explained a few times, they could render open XML documents without problems. You could take from one, put it in another, look whether you can read it, and so on. And it worked.